I'm going to focus on test organization, the grouping of tests into test suites and collections, ways that you can tag tests so that you can have more than just a hierarchical structure, but a cross-cutting structure. And finally, I'm going to talk about dynamic test suites, ways that you can combine those hierarchical and cross-cutting structures to manage your tests. All of that is going to be a setup for Alon to then talk about how SeaLights works with those features in the Katalon platform to let you do even more to optimize your test execution. So I'll start out just with where everybody starts. You are probably just recording tests. They're in a flat hierarchy. You start out with a simple set of tests here. I've just started my sort of test authoring journey with logging into my application, and it's pretty manageable. I can probably run all these in a few minutes. I've automated it. I'm good. Of course, as my system under test expands and becomes more complicated, so do my tests. But I can manage that. I can start to group them together into hierarchical folders. You can see here, I've now got my test cases broken up into maybe some of my web services that I'm testing, some common test cases that cross boundaries, and then I've got sort of my core main set of test cases. But it keeps going. I've got more tests. I start to break up my common test cases and my main test cases into even further categories based on function or the particular entity within my software that they're interacting with. Maybe I have a bunch of tests about the candidates. This is a candidate application that we're looking at, actually. So people who are applying for certain jobs. So maybe I'm starting to group together everything that's about testing candidates, or everything that's about logging in. Over time, that becomes too much, and I need to start taking all of those test cases that I've built up in my test case repository and start to group them into test suites that have particular functions. So maybe I have a test suite for just smoke testing, just finding out whether my system is ready to go out the door. Maybe it's not perfect, but I've hit all the high points. So I start to manually pick tests and put them into a test suite that I know performs a certain function. Maybe I have test suites for my various sprints. Maybe I have something that's a complete end-to-end, really covers everything. Katalon Studio and the rest of the Katalon platform let you create these test suites. So you can take the test cases and put them into lots of different groupings that you can execute together. Maybe not surprisingly, as we've been building up in complexity, I also need to consider how my test suites are going to interact with the environments that my software operates in. So we also have the idea of a test suite collection. A test suite collection for us is a way of taking a test suite and executing it in a certain configuration. Here you see our smoke test suite executing against a number of different browser and device platforms. This is a common use of this test suite collection construction because we're all building for a wide variety of deployment platforms these days. We also have the ability to manage different profiles. So maybe you have a test suite and you want to run it against a couple of different staging environments that you have that represent maybe different customer configurations or other configurations of your software. So all of the things that I've talked about so far have been largely hierarchical groupings of testing. So you can take test cases and break them out into folders and folders of folders. We can then group those into test suites, and we can have hierarchies of test suites. But oftentimes, probably every time, there are also cross-cutting elements of your test suite that you want to be able to identify and work with. For example, in each of your sort of groupings of test cases, you probably have some that are higher priority than others, things that are really critical to the functionality of your system. Or maybe you have modules that are spread across your systems. So here you see a feature that we introduced into the Katalon platform called tagging. Not uncommon in a lot of platforms, and it allows you to assign arbitrary tags to your test cases. So here I've said this is a P1, priority 1 test case. It tests the settings module, but it's also in the update profile grouping of test cases. And I can have within each of my hierarchical groupings, P1, P2, P3 tests that I can then pull together using a feature that we're going to talk about next, and that's called dynamic test suites. In contrast to the test suites that we've already talked about, where you are explicitly taking tests from your test case repository and placing them into a grouping, dynamic test suites let you define a test suite in terms of the features of the test. So the reason I introduced tagging was because a common use case for this is to take tests based on tags that you've applied so that you can quickly create a all P1 or all settings or all security test suite, and know that that test suite will always represent the current state of your sort of test system. Because as people add new tests, you don't have to update that test suite manually. You just have to make sure that those tests get tagged appropriately and they'll be pulled in. In addition to tags, you can also query based on ID, and that includes the ID of folders within the hierarchy. You can group by, as you can see, name, comments, descriptions. So this is a very flexible way of getting the right set of tests together. And that's going to be, just to kind of give a little foreshadowing, that's going to be a big part of what we leverage SeaLights to do, is to give us even more insight into what tests can run. Before I jump into that, I just want to mention that I've shown all these concepts for test organization within Katalon in the context of our Studio product, but these are also represented within our TestOps management platform. So you can see here that all those same test cases, test suites, all that information is preserved in our TestOps platform, where you can, just like you can in Studio, organize those tests, execute them, and view their results. Those same features are also expressed in our TestCloud product, where you can choose to execute those test suites, test collections that you've defined against different execution environments, different browser setups, and ultimately in the next quarter across mobile devices. But getting back to our dynamic test suites, something that I didn't mention and may not have been obvious, but is that test suite, that dynamic test suite functionality is provided by what we call query plugins. And those query provider plugins are available. Some are built in, but we also have some that are available in our Katalon App Store. And as you might imagine, one of those that we're really excited about is one that was built by our partners at KMS for our partners at SeaLights. And it's one that integrates Katalon Studio with the SeaLights quality platform and does two things. One, updates SeaLights with the results of Katalon test execution, and creates a new type of dynamic test suite within Katalon where SeaLights is able to inform us about what are the tests that ought to execute based on what SeaLights knows about what's changing in your application under test. And with that setup, I'm going to pass it over to Alon to talk about SeaLights and how they do this.